Now, uh, unfortunately, there's no easy way to tell you this. The Council of Ministers is a body that's all too easily. It's not your fault. I don't blame the people who came up with the names for these things, but there's two other councils that you might end up inadvertently confusing this body with. One is a body that we're going to be talking about next week called the European Council. Um, and I make this mistake even myself. I mean, you're probably going to hear me in this lecture calling what I'm talking about right now the European Council. I don't mean to, it just tumbles out that way sometimes. But we should try. I will promise to try, and you should promise to try to be precise with this. And we should call it the Council or the Council of Ministers. The European Council, something we're talking about next week, is different, related but different. And then there's also another group, our entity rather, called the Council of Europe, which is a distinct organization, a distinct international body, completely separate from the EU, that was set up in 1949 with the aim of promoting democracy, human rights, and the rule of law within 40 states of Europe. Um, Now, just to talk about the Council of Ministers or the Council, um, what does it do? Well, its main role is as the European Union's principal legislative body. We've been talking about the Commission just a moment ago as a kind of an executive and a bureaucracy, um, which has some power to call for legislation, to lead legislation. Um, but the council is the principal legislative body, and it is the body with the unique power to make legislation in certain specific areas. It is a power that it shares to a certain extent with the European Parliament. We're going to talk about the European Parliament next week. But if you really are struggling to kind of get your head around what the council is, this is a very simplified metaphor or analogy, and I don't know that it fully works. But if you were to imagine the European Union as a country with a bicameral legislature, in the United States we have a bicameral legislature because we have the Senate and we have the House of Congress. Um, um, we House of Representatives rather, excuse me. Um, the um, the council in that comparison would be the upper house. It would be like the U.S. Senate. Okay, and that's an interesting comparison as well because, of course, I come from Ireland, and the Irish Senate is very weak. It's more like the British House of Lords. It's not a very powerful Senate, so that would not be a good comparison. But the U.S. Senate has quite strong legislative powers in contrast with the British House of Lords or the Irish Senate. And so, in that sense, then you can maybe start to get the impression of what we mean when we say that this is the European Union's kind of legislative body alongside the European Parliament. So, what is in who do we find working in the Council of Ministers? Well, it comprises of ministers from each member state with responsibility for a variety of different policy areas. Um, so, as such, then, the thing about the Council of Ministers is to say that it's not a body that has a fixed membership. It's a kind of a floating concept in some ways that we attach to any meeting of one of the 9 distinct councils that are within the Council of Ministers. I'm not going to get into those 9 councils today with you. It's in the reading that you have, but that is to give you sort of a sense of what the Council of Ministers concept refers to. So critically, it is an intergovernmental body, right? And this is crucial because we have been rehearsing many times now a fear or a suspicion that many European citizens have of the EU as a kind of governed by anonymous bureaucrats that don't really care about the people or the people's desires, the people's needs, etc. In fact, this body, the council, is one of the bodies that really sort of gives lie to that notion, because it is a body that is composed of literally ministers from the governments of each of the European Union's member states. Um, and in that sense, then, it is the body perhaps that is closest to the democratic mandate of the populations of the various countries, right? Because those ministers are from parliaments, and those parliaments were directly elected by the people. They have leadership constituted by the party that received the majority of the votes in that parliament. So, in a sense, then, there is no person in the European Union's institutions that has a greater mandate to represent the will, the voice of the people, than the minister at this intergovernmental level. I really wanted to emphasize that with you because it's a crucial point, and that I think some people overlook when they start getting into this faceless bureaucrats kind of argument. When they say that, of course, they're talking about the Commission. The council is an important body, that it has these sort of strong legislative functions. It also has a certain degree of executive power, which it shares with the Commission. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while. And then, of course, we have to talk also about the rotating presidency aspect, and I'll give you a whole slide on that in just a little bit. So let's just first of all sort of think about this from a kind of a meta or theoretical context. So the big idea with the European Council is that it's the only location where you have systematic member state representation. As we were saying in the introduction, this is a primarily ministerial level institution. The ministers convene to review proposals from the Commission and the various amendments that have been proposed by the European Parliament. We're going to detail that next week. It's a whole separate body again. And they meet in sub-councils, and I can give you some examples of those. I said on the previous slide there were 9 of them, or did I say 10? I think I said 9. But just a couple of examples of the most important ones. Probably the most important one is the General Affairs Council, the GAC, or GAC, I suppose if you want to call it that, which discusses international policy and general policy matters. And this body is comprised of member states' foreign ministers and ministers with responsibility for EU matters. A very comparably sort of high-profile council is called ECOFIN, which is comprised of the finance ministers of the member states, and that's all going to be kind of dealing with finance issues. So GAC and ECOFIN are probably considered the most senior councils, along with the Agricultural Council, and they meet every month, while the other councils are going to meet probably just like 2, maybe 4 times a year, depending. So between actual meetings of the Council of Ministers, then you have these gaps, right? And the question is, do they turn the lights out and do they just go home and leave the building cold and no one in it? Not at all, right? There's a body of bureaucrats, career civil servants and diplomats who continue the work even after the ministers have broken their meetings up. So who are these bureaucrats? Well, there's 2 types of bureaucrat that we have to consider. One is called the permanent representation, and that is drawn from national delegations, which, as your book describes, have a kind of a status as being brought with the actual ministerial delegation. But there's another group which is really fascinating, called Coreper. And Coreper is a very powerful, probably the most powerful sort of civil service element in Brussels. because that's where this is all going down, right? Now, let me try to explain Coreper to you. It comes from the French term Comité des représentants permanents. Pardon my accent. I used to speak French very well, maybe not as much anymore these days. The primary role of Coreper is to prepare the agenda for the Council's meetings. And again, both permanent representations and Coreper are designed to maintain continuity. They're going to be there as representatives of the permanent government, or civil service, if you will, um, even as ministers come and go, political parties come and go in the national parliaments, governments come and go, of course. These are going to be permanent civil service that have memory of the dynamic nature and the momentum of the legislations and the initiatives that the various institutions are trying to introduce and to implement. So it's worth mentioning in this respect because both the permanent representations, but especially the Coreper, are great examples of what we've called vis-a-vis the Commission, this idea of a multi-actor dynamic or a multi-perspectival dynamic going on, interestingly enough, in a supposedly intergovernmental body right there as a supporting role below the ministers themselves. And I wanted to stop and think about that with you because I think it's very, very interesting. If you guys were thinking about term papers, you could do worse than look at how multi-perspectivalism, which is a concept we've been elaborating in relationship to European integration, is playing out in this very unusual and unexpected way in an intergovernmental body. How might we argue that multi-perspectivalism is playing itself out? Well, we have to think first of all about the fact that Coreper consists of ambassadors and their deputies, their assistants, all coming from the member states' national diplomatic corps, but stationed permanently, remember, Committee of Permanent Representatives, stationed permanently in Brussels because they've been assigned to the European communities as part of a kind of an embassy attaché in Brussels. And what's their job, right? Their job is to be experts, to be able to relay the technical details of what's being elaborated in the day-to-day activity of putting together the legislations, putting together the documents, the very, very sizable bodies of work that and studies of research that the Commission might be passing or trying to communicate to members of the Council. So there's a lot of work to be done here. It's very, very technical. There's tons of subcommittees toiling away in all of this all at the same time, working groups, and they're all made up of these civil servants that are seconded from the nation states. Now, why go into to detail about this, right? Because we expect the interministerial or the intergovernmental level to be kind of conservative, right? To be maybe an area where you'd see hesitancy to give away power of the nation state, to give away too much. You'd expect nation states to play a kind of a zero-sum game with each other at this intergovernmental level. And if anything, the emergence of this bureaucratic facet of the Council, the creation of this bureaucratic culture, attests to the possibility of a multi-actor political dynamic. These councils, these sectorally based working groups, etc., have a long history of working together. And remember, they are lifelong civil servants. And what seems to happen, according to the analysis, is that over time they develop what some people call esprit de corps, right? That they develop a sense of comradeship, they develop a sense of joint purpose. Even though they are from different diplomatic corps, from different countries, they work together every day. And over time, they develop a sense of rapport with each other. And so the question is, even though they work for the nation state, to what extent do they themselves then start to compose something like a transnational political community or a transnational policy community, a policy making community? And if they do, to what extent would that contradict our expectation that these would be people that would, because they're paid by the nation state, would continue, and they're from the nation state, that they would continue to represent solely the interests, the national interests? Again, it's just one of these areas where things get murky. It's probably not the case that they solely constitute a transnational policy community, although they partly do that. And it's probably not the case that they solely represent the national interests of the countries they come from, although they are partially doing that too. The truth, as is so often the case with these things, is probably somewhere in the middle. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, one of the things that we have to talk about is the rotating presidency. And this is a 28 member state European Union we live in now. And they take it in turns to assume the presidency of the Council of Ministers. And this happens for 6 months at a time in accordance with a pre-established rotation that's designed for like 10 years, 15 years out. Okay. And that's because, well, I'll get to that in a minute. But in the context of the last major enlargement, which happened in 2004, it was decided that the previous 6 months rotation, which was only between 15 member states, would continue until 2006. And then after that point in time, then you're going to have these very long sweep rotations, right? So you're talking about 14 years before you ever get to be the president of the European Council again. And that's a long time. Why might you want to be president of the council? Well, it's a unique opportunity, and it doesn't happen to a country very, very often, but it gives a member state profoundly important influence, an opportunity to shape the conduct of EU business during that 6 month period, which runs usually from January to June and from June to December each year. Now, why is that influence important? Well, just think about the kind of things that the presidency is responsible for. First of all, it's responsible for representing the council in its dealings with the other EU bodies, but also with outside bodies, outside the European Union altogether. So you are, if you will, when you're the president, if your country's the president, your diplomats are the face. Your minister is the face to the external world of not just your country, but the European Council. So that's one major gold star in terms of why you'd want to be, the president. Secondly, the president and the council's general secretariat, which is the council's civil service, set the agendas of the meetings. And they set the terms of the debates, and they set the frequency and the location of the meetings. That is going to be very important as well, of course, because you can use your knowledge of your your local spaces, you use your knowledge of your country to maybe try to create nice contexts, picturesque scenes. It might sound twee, but I mean, it's important, right? You want to really put on a show for people when you're the president. You're going to invite them to major council meetings in your national capital, for example. So a lot of this is going to be about kind of like showing how your guys are very professional, your civil servants are very professional, that they're prompt, that they're professional. And then finally, we have the question of the presidency's responsibility for launching, for generating projects to build consensus in and around initiatives, and to take the lead really in promoting the agenda of the European Union moving forward. So, three then reasons there: dealings with outside bodies and other uh, bodies even outside the EU, dealings with the local civil service and sort of putting on a good show, and then thirdly, sort of being the standard bearer, taking the lead in promoting the direction of European initiatives. Um, there's a sort of an inclination there uh, on the part of the member states then to compete with each other, um, to have a better presidency than the last person, right? Everyone wants their presidency to be seen, to be perceived as a success, and that's again just one of these things that sort of, while this is an intergovernmental body and you sort of expect it to be conservative and to be sort of full of cases of the nation states kind of seeking to um, manipulate the situation to their own selfish interests. In fact, the vernacular of the rotating presidency seems to be that, you know, you want to be seen to be the state that takes this very, very seriously, that really wins success for the European Union, not just for yourself. In fact, you're sort of putting your own interests on the back burner. Um, so, hosting these events, these European Council meetings, which is what the presidency has to do, they turn into very, very high profile events. The European Council is different to the Council of Ministers, of course, because it's where the prime ministers come and have major diplomatic sessions. Usually lasts about 48 hours, happens once every 6 months. These are, really your moment to shine and to demonstrate and to showcase your country's ability. We've one last topic to talk about here with the European Council, and then we'll call it a day, okay? And that is the question of voting. It's just worth sort of going through the numbers here to see how the larger countries have very, very highly weighted voting. They're highly weighted votes because they're very populous countries. But you see smaller countries like Denmark, Ireland, Lithuania, Slovakia, Finland have very small votes, and Malta, the least populated of all, having three. But also think about that for a second. Even three is still a very significant punching weight for a country with the population the size of Malta. And this is, of course, something that we see here in the United States with the Electoral College. So if you think you've seen this kind of logic before, yes, you have. Every election time we have people wondering why America has the Electoral College and why it is that, a vote in South Dakota is worth 6 times what it is in New York City. It's because of weighted voting. It's because you want to have disproportionately large amounts of votes attributed to the smaller countries so that they can kind of punch a little bit above their weight. And ultimately, if they want to, they can gang together, club together to try to balance out or weigh out the heavy hitters. Very, very hard to do, though, of course. So, how does this work, right? These voting weights. Well, the council votes either by unanimity for certain issues, very high profile issues, or for the rest of the issues by something called QMV, qualified majority voting. And that's the voting system that's used when issues are usually not very high profile. Now, according to the treaties, some subjects require unanimity, others don't. But under QMV, each member state has this fixed or weighted number of votes. The total number of votes when you add them all together is 345. And a qualified majority vote is going to be possible then if a decision reaches at least 75% of that, or 255 votes, which is the qualified majority threshold. And then that decision, of course, is then for certain instances you have what's called the triple majority, where it has to be approved then by the population of the European Union and also by the majority of member states as well. But that's a story for another day. So there you go. That's just a little bit on the European Council. I will probably pick up a little bit more on the Council next week. We're going to be focusing our time though on the European Parliament, which is that other branch of the legislative institutions of the European Union. We can't really talk about the two things separately, of course. So you'll be hearing a little bit more about the Council of Ministers next week. We'll also be talking about the European Council next week. So I'll see you then, and we'll talk more about these issues at that time. Thank you.